Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight on behalf of Express Media and Toolkit's Memoir. I am so excited to be hosting this live stream session with the amazing Amra Pajalic. I believe I said that right. I've been practicing in my head. I'm Zoya Patel. I am the facilitator for Toolkit's Memoir, and I'm really excited to be talking to you guys and participating in one of the few events that was always going to be online that is happening now. So before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on tonight, who are the Ngunawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and future. This is a really difficult time for a lot of people across the world and in Australia, and we do know that Indigenous Australians are particularly affected by the current crisis. So I do want to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the incredibly strong and rich culture of storytelling that we are so lucky to be part of here in Australia, and that has always been rooted in First Nations culture. And I hope that as we talk today, you guys can bear in mind the kind of the values that underpin certainly my approach to memoir, which is being respectful and being really grateful for the opportunity that memoir provides us to learn about other people's lives. And that's certainly something I felt a lot when I read Amra's beautiful book, Things Nobody Knows But Me. Things No One Knows But Me. And Things Nobody Knows But Me. I've got that correct now. And so to tell you a little bit about Amra before I start badgering her with my questions, she is an editor, teacher, and award-winning author. Her debut novel was The Good Daughter, and it won the 2009 Melbourne Prize for Literature's Civic Choice Award. She is the co-editor of the anthology Growing Up Muslim in Australia, and was shortlisted for the 2015 Children's Book Council of the Year Awards. And Things Nobody Knows But Me is her family memoir. It's an incredible book, and I highly, highly recommend it. And we did actually just talk about how Amra has covered a teasingly varied number of genres and styles in her writing history, which I think is amazing. So I guess the most obvious question, but one that will certainly give us the context that we need, is why, after writing fiction and children's literature, you decided to write memoir?
Well, I've been wanting to write this story pretty much for 20 years. I actually have a file from when I did a Diploma of Arts in Professional Writing and Editing when I was 20 years old, and I did a non-fiction class, and I started writing a family memoir about the women in my family, titled it Sins of the Mother. Bit judgmental there. And I had to submit 10,000 words, and I did that, and I got a C. So I got put right off there. I was done. And I sort of thought, okay, I'll leave that for a little while. Then I started working on a romance novel. And then I ended up going back and refashioning this story of my life as a young adult novel. And, was telling the story of having a mother with a mental illness in a non-English speaking background context, and the cultural expectations that you sort of have to navigate when you're between the two. Yeah. And I thought, I'm done. I've told that story. I can work on something else. And then at 31, I had my daughter, and I feel like I experienced some PTSD where I was just getting all these flashbacks from my childhood. I went through a period where I was really angry with my mum because this overwhelming crazy love you have for your baby makes you quite judgmental and fearful, and in this really negative space. And then when my daughter was 10 months, I had postnatal depression, and I was felled. Like I was so lucky. My husband, who I'm still married to, 23 years now, at that time, we had been together for 12 years. I had a stable, life, didn't suffer any trauma or anything that I thought was traumatic at that time. And I couldn't move. Like it really, it really took a lot out of me. I really understood the novel The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
That sense of being trapped, and you've got like this glass around you, and you feel like you're completely distant from everyone. And so through the process of doing counselling for the postnatal depression, I started writing memoir pieces. And at first it was like, this is just memoir pieces. I'm just going to write things and just sort of, submit them and do it in these small bursts. And then I had a few things published, and the word count started getting up, and I was like, oh, this is a memoir. I'm working on a memoir. And it was almost like I had to trick myself. I couldn't tell myself I was writing a memoir. I had to have launched into it enough to be able to make that announcement to myself. And
I find
then
that really interesting, because that makes it sound as if the process of writing the book was really organic. I'm sure it was, but it's also really neatly structured. So, and it's not a straightforward structure. So the book kind of moves between two perspectives, because we see aspects of your mother's life when you couldn't possibly have been present, and then, you know, your own experiences. And it also moves between Bosnia and Australia, and kind of, generations and timeframes. So did you find that you were writing it almost in I guess like snapshots, and is that how it came together, or did you kind of get halfway through the process and then decide what it would actually look like?
Yeah, I had to do the whole thing, and I still kind of work like that. I have to really launch very far into a book to be able to see what it is. I just have to kind of go with it. And I do this stupid thing where the structure has to be revealed to me. I almost can't impose a structure, and so it's a very, very long process. So that book, actually, that's the third draft, because the way I was writing it, I was influenced by Alice Pung's Her Father's Daughter.
Yeah.
And she wrote that in her point of view, first person, and in her father's point of view, third person.
Yeah.
And I read that and I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do with my memoir. I want it to be my point of view, but then I want it to be my mother's point of view. And at this point, I'd been working on it for a few years, and our relationship, you know, it's gone through ups and downs. And so we were in a good place. I was actually living around the corner from my mum. So I lived in Sydney, and when I came back with my husband, we bought a house that was literally like 6 houses away from her. So you would walk, you know, 5 houses and then one down. And so we had become very close, and our relationship had really transformed. And so I told her I was writing the book, and I asked her about it. And she said, if it only helps one person, I want to be a part of this, because I told her what my vision was. I wanted to write what it's like. You know, mental illness is so hard, and the stigma of it is so hard. But when you come from a cultural background where people don't understand mental illness and are very afraid of it, it makes it even more difficult. So she actually suffered a lot. We didn't even know the name of her illness. You know, I didn't know that it was bipolar until I was in until I was in high school. That's when I actually found out the name, and you know, we actually knew what it was and what the symptoms were. And so I interviewed her extensively throughout, and I recreated her life. There's actually like 50,000 words of it that didn't end up in the book, where I was like recreating her whole life, and wanting to sort of chart that whole thing. And then I submitted it to my agent, and she went, yeah, nah, you need to rewrite it in your point of view. And I went, oh, okay. And so I rewrote it this time in my point of view. So changed it all and restructured it a little bit. And at that point, she passed and was like, no. And I was like, well, I've spent 5 years on this book. I'm just going to stick in there. And thankfully, I had the support of Alice Pung. I'd actually received a grant from Creative Victoria to pay her to be my mentor. And so she was reading it and just going, this is good. You have to keep going. This is good. And I was like, okay. And so then I restructured it, and I finally kind of figured out, I found this online post that someone had written about how to write a synopsis. And I was entering my memoir in a competition. It's the Finch Prize, which I think is closed now. And so I had to write a synopsis, and I used this structure, which I can post so you can share with your participants. And I wrote this synopsis, and I went, oh, And then I had the structure of the book, and I knew how I had to restructure it and what I had to do, because I didn't quite know how to. On the one hand, I needed to tell the reader she's got bipolar, but on the other hand, I spent my whole life not knowing what it was.
Yeah.
So I finally had the vision of, it has to start with the prologue. It has to start with the moment that I know, and then go through this. And then also I really wanted to, and this took me a very long time, I wanted to do the snake. I wanted to do that thing where it's not the perfect chronology, where it's like you read it to a certain point, whoops, segue, look, this is what you need to know. Oh, let's read a bit more. No, segue again. So I really wanted that structure, because I love books that have got a bit of a complicated structure, that have got that bit of a shift in them, and you're like, oh, this is taking me on a journey. And so then I was able to also do that, where I was able to introduce certain sections in and, pop them in as they needed to be. And the other thing that I really struggled with was, when you're writing the memoir of your life, everything's important. So there was a chapter about masturbation. I don't know why, just my love of romance novels, and this was my sexual awakening. I thought this was important for people to know. And then there was a chapter about animals, just about, the brutality of living on a farm and what happens to animals. And I thought, this is a chapter I really want to include. And then when I did this synopsis and I was looking at the structure, I'm like, everything that is not about my mum and me, out.
Yeah,
out,
wow.
Out. And finally, like, it took 2 years, I was finally able to go, yep, out. This is it. And that is the version that got accepted for publication.
That sounds like such a intense journey. And, first of all, congratulations on your perseverance, because it's a great book.
Yes.
But what I find really fascinating about that is, it, like, from a reader's perspective, the structure is really smooth. Like, it doesn't feel as if you're jolted in and out. It feels as if you get the information at the right points. And interestingly, I think, it hadn't occurred to me until you just said it then, that part of the obvious struggle for you as a writer was making sure that you were still capturing the kind of the essence of how you felt growing up with your mum, and not knowing what her mental illness was, not knowing that it was something that, had treatment, and that there were other people who were experiencing that. But then at the same time, giving the reader enough context that they actually could follow that journey and kind of have the empathy and the knowledge to really get into your story. So that is such a curious challenge, and it's something that makes me particularly want to dive into that point that you made earlier about wanting to write from your mother's perspective, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about memoir, or they think about memoir, they think of it as only being a writer writing about themselves, their life, their perspective in the first person. And that's one of the challenges of memoir, is kind of trying to broaden the way that people think about it. Why did you feel that having both voices was crucial to this book? Why not just write about your experience of growing up with your mother who had a mental illness, and also living between those two cultures that you've grown up with?
I thought it was really important to try and at least capture a tiny bit of the essence of what it's like to have a mental illness, of what it's like to be always on the edge of, losing reason and out of touch with reality, about what it's like. My mum was, in a sense, I always have trouble pronouncing this word, but I'm going to try, infantilized. So she was always treated as a child, even though she was an adult. And part of that was her mental illness. Part of it was also that she did want people to take care of her, and she did want people to make decisions for her, and her struggling with agency. But I really wanted to capture that sense of, and that's what I was trying to do by going into her point of view. But it also helped to me write the book, because for so long I did judge her. For so long, all mothers and daughters have this relationship, like I'm experiencing it now with my daughter. She's 11 years old. I'm a teacher. She's remote learning. However, me making suggestions just does not fly. So, there's the way that we find our identity is in opposition to our mothers. I really took that to the nth degree, in terms of my identity and who I am being in opposition to my mum. She was a very passive person who never made decisions. I'm like, a bit crazy in terms of how decisive and almost.
You don't strike me as passive, no.
No, I'm really curt sometimes. I'm actually quite, diplomacy. Like at least once a year I get in trouble at work where I get called into the assistant principal's office and it's like, so that email that you sent, I'm like, what? I spent a lot of time on that email. It's like, no, darling. So, and also like, growing up with my mum, I was always out of the idea of what normal is. Like things that were normal to me were very abnormal to other people. And so, I really wanted to try and capture that from her point of view. So when I was writing and imagining her point of view and imagining some of these experiences, like, for example, when she was in the hospital in what was Yugoslavia then, and the way that people who were mentally ill were being treated, I was crying. I was actually crying, writing those scenes, imagining and remembering that was a time when I hated her. I hated her for leaving me behind and going to Australia and abandoning me, and then learning that she was literally on the point of suicide. She was suffering in such a deep and profound way because of the stigma of mental illness, being in and out of the mental hospital, the medication not working. It really shook me up and it gave me a whole different perspective. So I feel like trying to do that helped with the empathy, helped me understand, helped me heal my relationship with her. But it also took me out of that crying child, curled in the corner, why, Mummy, why? And I could actually heal myself and go, well, you know what? She wasn't perfect. She wasn't perfect. And, she did the best that she could at the time with what she knew. And there comes a time in your life when you have to lay down those burdens and that anger and that rancor. And again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'll assume I am and just keep going. And so, that helped me do that, I think.
Yeah. And I think what really comes out through what you've just said is that as a storyteller, first and foremost, even when you're writing memoir, whilst people think that's just about kind of giving your point of view, actually memoir is a vessel through which we can tell the stories that we think are really important and that aren't necessarily being seen the way that, ideally they should be. And your mother's story, I mean, I guess in a way it's like a really wonderful way to honor her by, telling her story, but also telling it as close to in her words and through her perspective as possible. Of course, one thing that immediately comes to mind is how involved she was then in the editing process. Because, if you're writing those things, you're interviewing her. She was obviously very happy with the concept of you putting the book out there, very proud of that. Did you run sections past her after you'd written them?
I had to read the whole thing when I finished before I submitted to a publisher. And at that point, she asked me to not use her real name. And so I actually made the decision and I gave everyone a fake name. I had a chart and everyone had a different name. And she was incredibly generous because she didn't ask me to change anything about her. It was only my stepfather that she wanted to protect.
Yeah.
And there were two things that she asked me to change about him, which I can tell you now because he's passed away. And she's also sadly passed away a few months ago. And so she just wanted me to change because he was very poor and he grew up in this house that was a very ramshackle house. And so she didn't want that advertised. And so, like the things that she wanted me to change were just things that she wanted, for him to protect him. Yeah. And then when she read it, we actually spoke on the phone because she just finished reading it and she called me and she said to me, "You really love me." And I said, "Yeah, Mum, I do." And she said, "You know me the best out of anyone." And that meant a lot. Sorry, I'm crying because she's passed away a few months ago, so sometimes talking who brings these things up for me. But I do love talking about her. So even if I'm crying, I don't want anyone to worry. I love talking about her and I want to talk about her. And that's why I wrote this book, because I wrote this book because women's stories are not told enough, because women's stories are domestic. They are about having children. They are about marriages. They are about, relationships, and these things are not seen as important, and it infuriates me. And also her life, she spent her whole life, she worked for a few years when she was young in a factory when she came here. And then my father passed away when I was 4 years old, and she went on a widow pension and then on a disability pension. And, her life was just taken up by her mental illness. And sometimes in society we form this view that people who are disabled in some way, what are they contributing to society? We've got these terrible judgments that we make, especially these days. And I really take that to heart. And I really wanted to honour her life and go, well, look at this woman. She has lived an extraordinary life. It was a life of great hardship. Like I just once told her, I read this book when I was young, and it was about like people having being reincarnated. And, this woman, there was this story about this woman who through the course of her life had broken every bone in her body. And then it was found, was it a man? Anyway, then it was found that they were an inquisitor in the Spanish Inquisition. And so this was penance for the pain that they had inflicted. And so I always have that in the back of my mind where I'm like, did my mum have a past life where she was like some evil mastermind, and then in this life, because in some ways it's just an extraordinary, painful, so much pain, and yet she has such a sense of humor about it, and she was
an extraordinary life. Just reading the book, she had, from my perspective, it seems like she had such courage in coming to a new country and kind of building her life and rebuilding it several times. Like the challenges that she faced were really unique. And I do think the love that you both had for each other is very clear through the writing. So it must be wonderful to know that she was here for the book's launch and was able to kind of celebrate that with you. I do think that sorry.
She didn't stop crying during the launch. I couldn't look at her anymore because every time I looked at her, I was like, so I stopped looking.
I had the same thing. My book was also a memoir, and it's funny what you said about her reaction being, wow, you really love me. I think sometimes when you're writing memoir, and particularly when you have I think for both of us, cultural difference plays a bit of a part in this, because in both of our cultures, talking about your family and being this open in public is not something that's commonly done. You don't kind of like share that level of intimate detail about your family publicly, let alone through a published book that complete strangers are going to read and will pass judgment on. And so having my parents at my book launch was something that was intensely scary for me. And then on top of that, my partner was there, and they kind of get along with him now, but barely know his family, and it's been very fractious. He's white, I'm not. Lots of intense Indian parental stuff going on there. The two families were at this launch at the same time. But my only goal, and my dad's phone rang during the launch, which was hilarious, but also not great. But the only thing I wanted was to see, my mum cry, because I knew that meant that she was just intensely proud. And a lot of people said the key thing that kept coming up from people having read the book was how much love I had for my parents, which I was so worried about, in some way misrepresenting them or upsetting them, or having people judge them on the things that I took issue with in kind of my upbringing, or the way that, me and my family kind of grew into our lives in Australia, that it didn't occur to me that, when you love people, it comes through your writing naturally. It's not something that you can control, really. It's just kind of naturally evident. But I guess the key thing that really changes the way that you approach memoir when you are from a culturally diverse background is that what you're protecting isn't just the individual people who might feature in the book. It's also about representing a culture the way that you want to, given you're operating in a framework where prejudice and discrimination and racism have coloured the way that any cultural difference is seen, right? So I wonder how that influenced the way that you wrote about your time living in Bosnia. And I could sense it a lot when I was reading the chapters, where you're there and you're living with your grandparents. I could kind of see how those would have been difficult in some ways to maneuver, just in terms of making sure that people had a kind of a complex and full view of your grandparents and their lives and the things that would have motivated and influenced the way that they kind of turned out to be. So how did you approach that?
I guess like with my grandmother, again, the same thing, like, you go through this point where you judge, and because she was not an easy woman. She was a very cold woman, and very reserved. But then as I learnt about her life, some of those things about her life I didn't find out until I started interviewing my mum. I didn't know them as a child, and so it gave me a completely different perspective about her. And there were more things that I knew that I did want to include originally, and actually I can talk about them now because everyone's gone. There was this cultural context of the possessive, the misogynistic culture, and she was accused of infidelity, and my grandfather was horrible. He abandoned her as a result of it, and I wanted to include all of that. And my mum said, at that time, that those were the times when if a woman just touched a man on the hand, her reputation was ruined. It didn't take much to ruin reputations and to, have your reputation just destroyed. And so there were stories I did want to include, but I ultimately made the decision not to include them because I didn't want to, I exposed myself more. And I talked about other people as I needed to and as I wanted to, give them a life and show who they were. But I also took the course to protect them as much as I could. But the irony is, and this is the fascinating thing, since my memoir has been published, my mum has been very happy with it. And I deliberately made the decision that this is my mum's story and this is my story. And I would only interview my mum and, write from her perspective. And I got her medical records from the Freedom of Information and used my own memories. And I recently, only when my mum passed away, I went to visit my aunt, and she was telling me these stories that were different to how she saw some of the things in my mum's life. And it was like my mother was an unreliable narrator and she had told the story in a different way. However, when I was listening to my aunt, I'm like, she's telling this story in a way to make my grandfather seem better. And so in a sense, it's not that there is no truth. There is truth. There is your truth. But it's all about perspective. It's all about who's telling the story as to what story they will tell. And my uncle, for example, has not spoken to me. And my mother has passed away and he's never called me to pass on his condolences or anything. So obviously he's pissed off for some reason. However, I don't ask why because I really don't care. So, even you make decisions where you think you're trying to protect people and you're trying to tell the story that you're telling, but it doesn't matter. People will still get offended, or people will have a different perspective, or people will have a different story, or they'll know something else. And so you are never going to get it right. You're never to please everyone.
I think it's interesting you use the term unreliable narrator there, which is such a good one to use, because I guess one of the fundamental facts of memoir is that there is no such thing as a reliable narrator. And in fact, we can never be reliable narrators of our own experiences because it's impossible. We absolutely do have different perspectives. And, on one hand, there can be really big differences of opinion, like some of the, your uncle perhaps and your aunt's relaying of stories that's quite different from what your mum remembers. On the other hand, some of the things that I found my parents took issue with in my memoir were really bizarre and trivial. Like my dad felt like the anecdotes that I included about our family dog weren't like the best ones, and we should have had different stories about that dog because everyone loved him so much, and just like weird stuff like that. So I feel like even when the subject matter isn't as complicated, it's just impossible to ever kind of, you know, assuage everyone's beliefs or views on how the story should be told. Now, I can see that we have a question from Twitter, so let me just have a quick look at this. So the question is that there's a common belief that you can only write one memoir, and as two younger writers having published memoirs, would we write one again, and what might we cover in a second memoir? Do you think you'll ever write more memoir? I know that you've just given me a sneak peek at what your next project is going to be, and it's fiction, but do you see yourself revisiting memoir?
Yeah, I actually thought I never would, because it has honestly been the hardest thing I've ever written. 5 years of just working on it and working on it and working on it. And then even when I finished it, you know, went to 5 publishers, got 5 rejections, and then another 5 publishers, and then so it has been a slog all the way.
Yeah.
And I thought, I will never write a memoir again. I'm not going to do that to myself. However, my mother passed away in November, and 11 months before that, my stepfather passed away. He actually committed suicide.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And so it's been, and I thought I'm never going to write a memoir again. And then going through his things and sort of gleaning a bit of an understanding about why he committed suicide and what was going on with him, what happened to him, I really thought I really want to look at, you know, depression in men and mental illness in men, and because there's also a lot of men in my family who have suffered from mental illness, and the different ways that it's manifested itself and the different ways that they have experienced it. And again, you know, it's a memoir about me and the impact of his life and his death has had on me. But again, I want it to be a memoir, a family memoir in a sense, about you know, the people in my life, and so I guess in one sense, like, I want to write a memoir, but it can't ever be just about me because I'm not that interesting, and I don't want to be that interesting. But the purpose of memoir is to explore universal stories, to explore things that other people can relate to, and to explore them from a perspective that only you can. Like, what is the unique thing that you can offer? And, you know, while there are a lot of people out there who are males who are writing about mental health and depression, what I would be writing about is, again, that cultural context and the context of not seeking help and not getting assistance, and also within our family, like, I'm sorry to say, he was threatening suicide for 30 years. And for us, it became background noise. And then as he deteriorated and it actually happened, it was the most shocking thing in my life, because everything I thought I knew about the world and about people was just completely shaken up. And so it's also that perspective of thinking that you know people, but you don't actually know people. And so the answer is yes. I never thought it would be yes, but it is. However, I need perspective and I need time. So this is not something I will be launching into anytime soon, because I also sometimes, remember, you have to decide what is the right time to write. And sometimes when you're going through something, writing about it might help you. But sometimes when you're going through it and actually writing about that life experience, it might hurt you. It might actually put you in a very negative space, because writing my memoir about my mum, I did go through points of depression and you know, like, really struggling and having to take breaks for a few months and not write, and find something else to kind of do a little bit writing or creative related.
And I think that's a really good point, actually, that often it's not about what you're writing so much as it being the right point in time for you to actually be writing that particular book or that particular piece. And I definitely think with memoir, that's even more important. I guess for my part, I will definitely write more memoir, but that's also because I don't necessarily see, I think, you know, one of the crucial points about Memoir is that it's not autobiography. It is, as you said, Amra, all about writing about universal truths. And being a memoirist, in my view, is actually about being able to, look at the world as you live in it and pluck out those important kind of themes and those universal experiences that are inspiring to you as a writer and that you kind of can't get out of your mind. So I absolutely think that I will. But again, I do think that often the books or the topics or the ideas have to percolate in your mind for however long, and you don't even know, but your brain is background processing that, for possibly years before you actually get to the point where you want to sit down at your computer and actually type it out. So I find that very exciting, though, because I love reading your memoir. So I look forward to that, even if it's 5 or 10 years down the track. We'll keep an eye out.
Who knows? The way I write, it's a whole process, and it's like, I write twice as much as what actually ends up being published. And I keep going, I'm going to get more efficient, and I don't.
My question. So you said that you wrote a lot of content for this book that in your editing and redrafting process you kind of cut out and decided to kind of bring the focus in a lot more. Will you do anything with that content that's been written? Have you thought about kind of submitting it as shorter pieces or recrafting any of it?
I have attempted submitting it to different places, but the problem about submission is it's actually work. Like to submit something, you actually have to dedicate time to editing, to finding a place, to submitting, and so I have done it with a few pieces, and I don't know if anything's quite happened. But the problem is also you get to a point where you're like, I've had enough of that. I need to move on to new things. And so now I'm at the point of wanting to move on to new things. But the interesting thing that's happened as a result of writing the memoir is that I'm starting to sort of do freelance writing. So I've been getting things published on SBS Voices. And that's also been really good. But it's all like, memoir pieces, it's all pieces about what I'm seeing in the world and what I want to share and what has this got to do with other people. And so that's making me a little bit better at it also, to sort of think about what is this little idea, what is this point that I've got, what is the voice that I've got, or something unique that I have to say. So I definitely will be trying to rework the pieces, but I work full-time as a teacher, and then, in order to write before all of this that's going on in the world, I would wake up at 5:30 in the morning and write before I did a full day of teaching. And so it's slow.
Yeah.
And laborious.
For that, though, that's pretty amazing that you can for a start, wake up that early and be productive, but also fit it all in around everything else that you're doing, which is a lot. I've just seen another question come through from Twitter, which is, what are your thoughts about good damage, which is the belief that you can have trauma that is good or useful because you can get creative inspiration from it? And did you find the process of writing about trauma healing?
Personally, for me, I definitely found the process healing. I feel like putting all of that into the cover of a book means that it's expunged a little bit from my brain. And also, when you are writing your life and you're curating your life and you're shaping it, it becomes like something outside of you. It becomes, I don't know, it almost feels like my memories are now sepia. They are not as technicolor as they were, and I like that. I actually like that because a lot of those things were in there. I don't know about good damage. I think that we tell ourselves stories that we need to tell. We refashion our experiences. And so, when I, for example, suffered a miscarriage when I was 33 and realised I wasn't going to have another child, I refashioned that into a narrative about creativity and dedication to the one child that I had. However, before I had the miscarriage, I had seen all these universal signs about this was the time for me to get pregnant and this was meant to be, and this baby that I was going to have was only going to be 2 days different to my daughter's birthday, which is something that runs in my family. Like my sister and I are 1 day apart in our birthdays, even though 7 years. And all three of us, my brother was supposed to come on the 22nd of June, but he came earlier. We're all Germanized. And so, you know, there was this like mystical thing. And then I had the miscarriage. And then I was like, oh, it wasn't mystical. And then I got chickenpox when I would have been 7 months pregnant. And it's like, well, it's a good thing that pregnancy didn't proceed, because I would have had a baby possibly with, disability or brain damage. However, these are all stories I had to tell myself. I had to refashion my reality into a way that I could process this truth and process what happened. So I don't think necessarily that there is any good damage, because I think that there are people out there who have gone through horrific things and would be basically saying, can I swear on this?
I mean, I feel like you can. I don't know what the rules are, but maybe we'll just
I'll do some fudging, okay? Yeah, I'll do some fudging. I think there are people out there who have been through some horrific things who will be going, fudge you and your whole fudging thing, that was some universal fudging truth, okay?
Yeah. I mean, my immediate reaction is it's such a point of privilege to be able to say, well, at least I got to write something from it. Whereas I do think that you could flip that and say writing or having a creative outlet, whatever that is, can be such a wonderful source of catharsis and a source of potential healing. Whereas I think most people would happily forego trauma if they could. Granted, I do think that going through difficult things does create a lot of our identity. And I'm sure that you would feel that way. It sounds as if, even going through the process of interviewing your mother and going back through a lot of your shared history kind of brought to life how much your identity and your personality has been crafted both in contrast to and as a response to her and your family more generally. So I guess there's like a way in which everything we experience in life obviously contributes to the goods and the bads that we experience, which is a balanced way of saying that I agree with you, and that I'm sure many people who experience trauma would indeed be saying fudge you. I did want to ask you a little bit about kind of more general responses to the book, and if anything has surprised you about the way that it's been received. I thought that was so interesting what you just said about feeling as if your memories have kind of become sepia toned, because certainly I felt as though by writing about things that had otherwise been kind of the shared history of just the people who were involved, it kind of creates it makes them feel like they're a cultural artifact, like our shared experiences have some meaning beyond our lives because now they're kind of enshrined in this book and are being consumed by other people. But that's also a really weird feeling. I just wonder if, there were reactions or responses to the book from strangers that surprised you, or like interpretations that you were a bit like, like that's not necessarily what I meant for you to get out of that, but okay. Any particular stories?
Yeah, there was this really weird week, and it was so funny because it happened in a week. So I received an email from a man who had read my book and who said, as a father, he goes, I've had to learn what your stepfather learned. And then he put in quotation marks this line I had about my stepfather, he had to decide whether he was going to be a playmate or an adult. To be one, he had to lose the other. And he goes, that really made me, I really connected with that, because as a father, that's what I've had to experience. And I thought, that is so interesting. Like, I'm thinking I'm writing the book about the women in my family and their stories and their struggles and their journeys, and this man connected with that. And then a few days later, I received an email from a man who was Bangladeshi Muslim, and he connected with my father's story. And my father, he beat my mother, and he beat her brutally. He was a very, misogynist, not a misogynist, but a man who was like women. Sorry?
Patriarchal?
That's it. That's the one. So he was very much like women had their place, and men, I'm a man and I'm the one who decides everything. And this man was talking about his life, and he said, I had to learn that the cultural heritage that I had in Bangladesh I could not bring here, and I ended up in jail for beating my wife, and I had to, learn that these are the things that I have to let go of.
Yeah.
And I just thought, wow, that is not something that I would have ever in my lifetime have imagined. And that's actually where I got the idea about writing the memoir about my stepfather, because I'm like, there is a space for that. There is a space for stories about men of non-English speaking background and their cultural experiences in Australia that we're not seeing, that we don't see those stories told, and that people out there are hungering for and will connect with.
And there is a real gender slant in memoir towards women.
Yes.
In women write more memoir, women feature more in memoir. Women's stories are the ones that are typically told in memoir. So that is really interesting, and certainly not what I would have expected to be kind of the overarching, it's not even overarching, it's just like random to have that kind of reaction when you're not expecting it at all.
And in 1 week, that's what was the really strange thing, because I was like, sometimes just the universe does this strange thing where it sends you like a theme or a message.
Yeah.
And this is, again, me telling my story, this is me receiving a message from the universe. That there is a need for this story. So, this is me being a storyteller. Everything in the world has got a reason, and I have to find a way to fashion it for myself. But yeah, those were things that, and then there were some amazing emails from people who connected with it in different ways and for different reasons, as, daughters, as mothers, as, people just, one woman who traveled through Bosnia and loved Bosnia and was like, oh, this reminds me of, when I lived there. It was just, and that's the thing about memoir that you don't realize until you write it, which I love, because no other book have I ever received emails or reader contact. So it's like, oh, somebody read it. Yay!
And I think my all the time PSA whenever I do any event, if I can work this in, I always say to people, like, please contact writers. If you really like someone's book, please tell them. There's nothing like getting an email or a tweet or just like a nod and a wave from someone who has had any kind of reaction to our work. Like, honestly, I would even happily talk to people who didn't like my book, partly because the people who don't like my book are largely racist. That seems to be is my take on racism in Australia. But I do think memoir is such a it's such a source of community building that you don't necessarily expect. And I think we're quite lucky now that we have these digital forms that people can contact us through as well.
When you go through reads and you're like, oh, I got 2 stars, and they're like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you read it. I don't care.
I remember one of my favorite memoirists, and the Toolkits participants will be sick of hearing this because I go on about Cheryl Strait a lot because I just love her. But her memoir, Wild, which is incredible, she said in an interview that I listened to once that it's really funny because there are 2 types of people. Oh, yes, excellent. It's almost didn't I swear. She said in an interview once that there's 2 types of people who really, really connect with her book, and they're really like worlds apart. And one is people who've experienced, grief and loss in their lives, because she writes a lot about losing her mother, and that's what kind of triggers the whole journey. And then the other is like hardcore hikers. So people who are like, I really related to your story of losing 5 toenails while hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. And I just love that, because it shows that, as you've kind of said, people read your work through their own biases and their own story, and everything that they've experienced is influencing the way that they interpret your experiences. I guess the flip side of that, though, is that it's a much more exposing experience for the writer. You're not kind of sheltered by the fact that it's fiction. It's not it's something that will influence the way that your future works might be read, because people suddenly feel as if they know you on a level that to you, they're complete strangers, but to them, you're someone who they have a deep amount of insight into. How does that feel? Like, having written fiction before, is that a weird difference? Is it something that you've even noticed? Do you feel exposed at all?
I remember one of the first and one of like the memoirs that have stayed in my head is Lucky by Alice Sebold, and she's the most well known for The Lovely Bones. And this memoir, it's quite horrific. It's about her being raped as an 18-year-old college, and she was a virgin, and it's about the experience of the rape and the year and the aftermath and everything that she went through. And she wrote this book when she was in her 40s, and she said people would read it and they would, and they'd think of her as that 18-year-old and they could see her as the adult that she was. And they would be like, oh, you must be so traumatized. And she's like, 20 years later, it's okay. I'm good. And that always stuck with me. And so when I was writing my memoir, I actually deliberately wanted to end it when I'm like 18 years old, because I needed that protection of this is me as my, the young person, and then this is me as the adult. And I didn't care about me as a young person, because I'm like, you know what? Everyone who's young does stupid things. So, if anyone's going to judge me for the stupid things that I did, in my youth, go for it, but I'll end it. And then when I was writing it, I sort of realized I needed to include a little bit of who I am and a little bit of me as an adult. So I sort of deliberately put little clues throughout. And then I was like, damn it, this isn't going to work where I'm just going to end it where I'm like, 17, 18. The readers are just going to be like, this is so unsatisfying and crap. And so I needed to build a bridge between the person I was then and the person I am now. And I also didn't know how to end the bloody thing. I always had this vision of it would circle back to the beginning of when I found out about the bipolar, and I would end it there. But I'm like, nah, that's not going to work. And I was like working on revisions and like, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I went to visit my mum, and my mum and my daughter had this crazy conversation that I'm like, oh, this is it. This is the bridge. This is the bridge between me as the child and the adult, and the bridge between my mum and me, my daughter, because she was the one that was the bridge. She was the catalyst for me writing it, and she was the one who, healed that relationship, because it's only when I became a mother that I could really understand my mother. And I'm going to put this out on a limb, all right, and people can, say on Twitter what they think. I completely think everyone is like that. I think until you actually go through that experience, you're always going to have a different point of view. And then when you actually go through it and you're like, shit, this is bloody hard. And all these, notions that you had, I'm going to be this sort of a mother. Like I always said, I'm going to have boundaries. I'm going to be the mother and she will be the daughter. And, because my mother told me everything. And I'm like, no, I'm going to be her friend. And now every day I'm like, am I your best friend? I'm your best friend. Like, yeah, Mum, you're my best friend. But so is my dad. But you're my best friend. I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm your best friend. And so it's like, funny what I thought how my relationship was going to be. And I'm doing the same thing that my mum does. I talk to her about all sorts of inappropriate things. And, these are things that my mum used to talk to me about. And I was like, and I'm doing it. So it's funny how you think that you're not going to be something, but so much of, seeps in. So I don't remember what the question was and what I was coming back to.
It was about feeling exposed, but I think that's actually quite interesting, because by kind of what you're saying is that the perspectives that different people are going to bring to your book are actually so dependent on their own experiences, who they are, what point in their lives they are. Like, I find that the difference between white Australians who read my book and people of color who read my book, worlds apart in terms of the feedback, but also the way that they engage with it. And like, neither is better or worse than the other. It's just that there's a sense of like gratitude and solidarity from people of color who read my book and who say, this is, I really resonate with that, this thing. And often they'll confess, this experience of racism that they had, or this interesting thing that they experienced that is really relevant. And there's a point of real connection. And like similarly, but different, a lot of white Australians will say, thank you, I hadn't thought about it that way. Or like, this thing made me think, I might ask questions, but it's just it's completely different, right? And I imagine it's the same, particularly when you're writing about that crucial relationship between mother and daughter, the difference between people who have daughters, reading your book versus people who are daughters but don't necessarily have that experience of motherhood. I imagine it would be really different. So that's actually quite interesting, and not something that I'd really thought of before, but now I'll have to go back and read your book once I have a child.
Yeah. That I would say, just when people are writing things that they remember that you can write, and you can write for yourself, and then you need to write, and you need to write for publication. And so you need to make sure what your purpose is. And sometimes you just need to write and just leave it and then think about publication. And so in terms of exposing yourself, when I was accepted for publication, I was going through it and I was changing things, and there are a few things that I cut because I was like, oh, this is really happening. Because when I was writing it, I had to go, this is never going to get published. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to put everything out there, everything, and act like no one's going to read it. Okay. So you have to be fearless. And then when you get to the point of publication, you shit your pants, and then you start going, yep, red pen, thank you, red pen, red pen.
Yeah. That's so true. And I actually want you to kind of hold that thought, because I'd really like to come back to that in the second half of this session. I can see that we don't have that many minutes left for the live stream. So I kind of want to give you a chance to let people know, what you're working on at the moment, what kind of, in particular, I'm kind of interested in what you think people can do to support writers during this really weird COVID-19 time that we're in. Anything that you'd like to plug, or anything that's been helping you kind of get through it all, as well, particularly from the perspective of your writing?
Well, at the moment I'm struggling with writing because I'm remote teaching, so I'm staring at the screen all day. I think in terms of supporting other writers, buy books, talk about books, contact the readers out there, the writers out there, and just share your perspective, to go back to, that's really important for us. And I think also just an acknowledgement that the arts sector is hit so hard. And if there are any ways that, people can support the arts sector, like just getting out there, and I know sometimes it can be hard with work and stuff and attending events. I know that it's something that I struggle with, working full time. And so I actually made myself a goal that once a month I had to go to some literary event, and I had to attend something. And every year I would attend something at a festival. And so, just make those small goals. And anyone who is interested in writing, that's also really important, that you do create that sense of community by contributing. Like, there are people that I'm friends with. Like, I met Alice Pung at an awards night, I don't know how many years ago, 10 years ago. I met Diva Oren, who's an incredible writer, and who's my co-editor, at a writers' festival. We just started talking as people of European background who are writers, and there aren't many of us. We're like, we must be friends. So that's what I would say from that perspective. In terms of what I'm working on, I had this conversation with my husband a few years ago, because I actually am a failed romance writer, and I've had romance novels published under a pen name. And when they didn't succeed and I didn't make that bucket of money that I was expecting, my husband had some advice for me, where he said, what do you have to say that no one else can say in the world? And so I'm like, the story of Bosnia, the story of my heritage, the story of my culture. And so that's the stories that I keep coming back to. And so at the moment I'm working on a novel that's set during the Balkan War in a city called Srebrenica, and that city is known for a massacre that occurred there in 1995 when 8,000 men and young boys were killed. However, before that, that city was under siege for 3 years, a brutal, brutal siege. And so I'm telling the story of a girl growing up through that. And I love the book, and I love the research that I'm immersed into, and I'm feeling sad at the moment that I don't have the energy to dedicate to it that I want to.
Well, that does sound absolutely incredible. And I'm sure that I'm not the only person now who is really hoping that you find that energy and that remote teaching gets somewhat better, because it sounds like it's absolutely so difficult. Thank you everyone who's joined us for this live stream. We are going to be turning it off very shortly. So thanks again. And I believe a recording will be put up on the Express Media YouTube for anyone who didn't catch it. And Toolkit's participants, stay on the line.
Thank you.